Hello and welcome to another episode of It Came From the Page. And today we are going to be talking about novelizations. So GarbAugust is full in swing by now, and the third week of GarbAugust is all devoted to novelizations. Now, regardless as to whether or not I think that it's accurate to call them trash, they are for the sake of GarbAugust. I'm not winning this battle anytime soon. Novelizations, I am most interested in novelizations of film, but there are novelizations of plays, there are novelizations of TV series, there are novelizations of miniseries, there are novelizations of video games. Most forms of media that are not specifically on the written word have been adapted to novelization form at some point in their existence. Novelizations have existed since the birth of film. There are even novelizations of films that were written in the 1900s, the early 1910s, and even before. So it's not a new phenomenon. Since their inception, though, they have kind of been the red-headed stepchild of the literature market. All they are is written word adaptations of a medium that is normally focused on being a visual medium. It is no different from doing a film version of a book, in my eyes. There's no difference. The big difference people always kind of bring up is that novelizations were often written for profit, and just because that they were kind of part of a marketing boom or marketing push for a film, therefore they're trashier. And that has never, for me, never held much sway one way or the other. One, we live in a capitalist hellscape. You got to make money any way you can. You should have no shame. Two, nobody would adapt a book to film if they didn't think that it would be profitable and make money. That's just how all entertainment business works. So I've never understood that argument, but regardless, it's been there since the birth of cinema, and people have, especially in the literature world, always kind of looked down upon novelizations. So there are a number of very famous novelizations out there. The only one that's from the earlier 1900s that will still get reprints and is still kind of in the public consciousness is the 1933 King Kong novelization. Now, this is a reprint. This is the Frank Frazetta reprint that was made to coincide with the 1976 film. Now, this has a long, complicated history and is something that millions of dollars have been spent on the novelization itself. So when this novelization was being conceived by Marion C. Cooper, he brought in the famous writer Edgar Wallace to write the novelization for King Kong. And Edgar Wallace was also going to do a run at the screenplay for King Kong. But what had happened is Edgar Wallace died way early into the process. So Edgar Wallace didn't have anything to do with the novelization for King Kong. There is some argument as to whether or not he was involved in a version of the script for the original 33 King Kong, whether he had a few rewrites in there, whether it was just some notes. There have been many historians for King Kong who have argued the fact and have tried to narrow down what is the involvement of Edgar Wallace. But regardless, Edgar Wallace, who was a famous writer of the time, Marion C. Cooper wanted to have a novel released before the film in order to make it look like he was adapting a famous book by a famous author to kind of give the film a little bit more cred. Unfortunately, Edgar Wallace died, so the novelization was actually ended up being written by Delos W. Lovelace. Now, the reason why this is a novelization that's so important to the history of film is that in the early days of copyright, the copyright belonged to Marion C. Cooper. Marion C. Cooper, there are many stories. Either he's lost the copyright, either he just forgot to renew it. Whatever the matter is, this was put into the public domain. And because this is a novelization, but because it was never intended to look like it was a novelization, that makes this version of King Kong free game to adapt. So people can actually adapt this with absolutely no repercussions. Now, there's some added things to this. You can't just reprint the book or republish the book because the publishing rights belong to the Mary C. Cooper estate. So the publishing rights for this are still something you would have to license to republish the book, but in terms of adapting the book, you could do that anytime you want. This is something that really came to head in the 70s, specifically 1976 and 1975, when they were rearing up to do the new King Kong movie. Dino De Laurentiis was planning and was making his version, and Universal at the same time was trying to make their own version of King Kong. And what happened was both of them thought that they had the go-ahead to remake King Kong. Dino De Laurentiis had it in writing. Universal just had it as a verbal agreement. And they both were started to do this. So all of a sudden, Universal is like, we were started pre-production on this. I can't believe this. We need to make the stupid film before they do. But how are we going to do it? So there's a huge court case. And then they discovered a little loophole, which is nobody did the renewal for the novelization rights for King Kong. This has eventually what happened is there is no 1975 or 1976 version of Universal's King Kong. That's because it was basically a race near the end of the... It was a race in the early 70s to actually start filming first. And Dino De Laurentiis started filming first. They were both like, the market cannot sustain two of these films, therefore it dropped off. But there are still plenty of unofficial official King Kong adaptations based on the novelization. There's a number of differences. One of these days I will go into that, and also the many other literary adaptations of King Kong, and that is a video for another time. But it is by far the most famous movie novelization of all time. But other films that it was contemporary with did have novelizations. So Bride of Frankenstein does have an original novelization. This is not it. This is the 1977 version of the Bride of Frankenstein novelization. So they did a number of newer novelizations for these old school horror films. Many of these are actually pseudonyms for Ramsey Campbell. Not all of them. It's kind of interesting because there is a introduction by Ramsey Campbell in this as well. So it's odd, but for whatever reason, Carl Dreadstone, which is a great pseudonym, was used for the printing of these. But there is a original 1930s novelization as well. As to all accounts, I believe it's lost. Not entirely sure. I've never seen one put up digitally or put up for sale anywhere. It might be one of those things that somebody in a library has it sitting somewhere. So maybe one day we'll get that original 1933s. But regardless, there is a Bride of Frankenstein novelization that is from the 70s as well. So there's a lot of interesting histories with novelizations. But novelizations were not just for horror films. There was a number of genres that were novelized. Any type of film, especially if you're in a certain era, most notably the 70s and the early 80s was kind of the prime time for novelizations, because this was really before the big home video boom. So what would happen is if you go to see a movie, you might only see it once in your entire life, or if it's popular enough to get it rerun, you'll be able to see it then. But there wasn't this streaming landscape of being able to revisit your favorite films over and over again. So novelizations kind of filled in the gap. You'd be able to buy a novel based on your favorite film and be able to relive it through the novel. But as I was saying, there were not only horror-based novelizations. Those are the ones that are most popular in the modern day. We'll get to that in a second. But there were also sci-fi novelizations. So this is not by George Lucas. This is actually by Alan Dean Foster. Alan Dean Foster is the god of novelizations. I don't believe anyone alive has written more movie novelizations than Alan Dean Foster. He's been doing it for ages, including, yes, the original Star Wars film. But this was back in that weird period where sometimes they want to hide the fact that there were people doing novelizations. and weren't just from the minds of the filmmakers themselves. So that's why it says a novel by George Lucas. George Lucas did not write this. This was by Alan Dean Foster. Of course, Star Trek, of course, has novelizations for everything. There are novelizations for specific episodes of Star Trek. It really is kind of like all expansive in that regard. There were also novelizations for Westerns. This is from Sergio Leone's The Man with No Name trilogy. This is a novelization for A Few Dollars More. There were novelizations for kids' films. So Herbie Rides Again, Harry and the Hendersons. Like I said, there was a huge swath of novelizations, and they hit all corners of content. If you like romance movies, there's romance novelizations. Whatever type of film or property you enjoy, chances are somewhere in the history there are a novelization of it. Somewhere. A lot of very famous authors actually started out in movie novelizations, many times under a pseudonym because, like I said before, the literary landscape overall does not look kindly on novelizations. For example, this is The Funhouse by Owen West. Now, Owen West is the pseudonym for Dean Koontz. This is a Dean Koontz novelization, not a very good novel, but regardless, this is one of the ways that Dean Koontz got his chops back in the day, is he did some novels for some horror movies. So it's just a very interesting thing. We always kind of crap on novelizations, but a lot of very famous writers popped in and, got their start novelizing film. And also people like Chelsea Quinn Yarborough, Sean Hudson did a Terminator novelization. There is also another Terminator novelization. So the Sean Hudson one was released in the UK. It's much shorter. The idea is that he only had the film itself to go off of, where Randall Frakes and Bill Wisher actually had the original script, and that's why it's a little bit more chunky here, because they were able to adapt scenes that didn't actually appear in the movie. That is another thing that's worthwhile to mention about novelizations. Oftentimes they are adaptations of the script. Now in the modern era, which we'll get to where novelizations are at the end of the video, but for many, many years it was studio would give you the script, you would have the book released coincide with the movie, usually comes out a little bit before the movie. Oftentimes they didn't see the film at all. And this always kind of adds to some interesting elements of many novelizations, is that sometimes they're written off of an earlier script for a movie. There is a very famous Jaws 2 novelization that is very, very clearly written off of an earlier version of the script. It makes it a lot more interesting to read, and actually does give the novelization some historical merit, especially if you're doing a history on the film Jaws 2 and its various iterations. That film had a lot of production troubles during it, and you can even see that happening in the novelization. Another thing, like I said, there are novelizations from different countries. For example, these are not just English-speaking countries. There are countries all over the world of all different types of languages who have their own novelizations. Specifically, the Alien franchise, there is a novelization for Prometheus that is only in Japan. There is a Japanese-only novelization for the film Prometheus. That is a very odd thing indeed, because there are novelizations for every Alien and Predator film except for Predators. There's no novelization for Predators. There was a comic book tie-in for that. There is nothing for Alien vs. Predator Requiem, probably for the best, and there's nothing for Prometheus. But there is novelizations for all other films in the thing. There are occasionally, just because of how the landscape of publishing works, there can be, in very famous movie series, there can be weird movies that never got a novelization. So if you're collecting novelizations, there's just this weird hole. For me, the one that always eats at my heart and soul is that there was never a Jaws 3 novelization. So there is a Jaws 2 novelization, and there's a Jaws the Revenge novelization. There is no novelization for Jaws 3. It always irks me every time I look at my bookshelf, but that's neither here nor there. But yeah, novelizations are not restricted to the countries that are English speaking. They are all over the world. Now, there's also novelizations from TV miniseries. Like I said, this is a terrible, terrible TV miniseries, but apparently the novelization is quite good. This was a Godzilla 1998 ripoff movie called Gargantua. The plot does not have that much in common with Godzilla 1998, but its marketing and the way that it was greenlit was to coincide with the release of that movie. So that's why it's kind of like a Godzilla exploitation, if you want to say that. Now, I've talked about it a little bit before, but the reason why most people nowadays would know about novelizations is because of horror films. Horror was always the redheaded stepchild of the cinema universe. Most critics always crap on horror, and so it made a great pairing with novelizations, who were the outcasts of the literature world. So many horror movies of the 1980s and beyond have novelizations. These are the only novelizations that really retain value in the modern market. So for example, Friday the 13th Part 3 3D, this novelization is worth some pretty change. I did not spend the high amounts of money to get it, but it is a very expensive novelization. It's horror, for whatever reason, is one of the only genres where the fans are cuckoo bananas, and we love to buy novelizations, and we've always loved them. So it's always fun because a lot of times with horror, there were MPAA cuts to the film where they weren't able to go as far as they wanted with some of their kills and things like that. So you'd actually be able to feel and see the entire mutilation and bloody history of the murders through novelizations. In the modern era, it's kind of complicated. Novelizations have become a weird beast, to say the least. Horror movies still do get novelizations, and in fact, they're one of the only places anymore where you can find modern-day mass-market paperbacks. The format has kind of gone the way of the dodo, but as you can see, most novelizations are in that style. So, not all, though. We'll get to that in a second. Companies that do novelizations are kind of few and far between. The more mainstream publisher that does still seem to be interested in doing novelization is Titan Books. They still do it, and most novelizations, if you find them in the modern day, if you look at the publisher, it's Titan Books. So Titan Books is kind of keeping the novelization alive in the mainstream, but the more independent and rarer to find novelizations are from independent studios now, who are releasing these as limited edition paperback onlys. Now, this irks me, especially in the modern day. I would love for all of these to be easily accessible for everyone. I don't understand why these companies don't just, especially after the work sells out, because oftentimes these limited run books sell out super quickly. I do not understand why there's no ebook available to purchase. Even if it's just on the site, I'll pay you $10 to get an EPUB copy of some of these books. And I'm sure a lot of other people would as well. It might have to do with modern day licensing, unclear, but a lot of times independent companies that release novelizations and write novelizations have very limited quantities. So these are Severin books. Severin is mainly a Blu-ray and DVD company, but they've recently got into the novelization game. So there is a novelization for Cruel Jaws, and there's a novelization for Night of the Demon. Now, there are other companies doing these. Recently, I was talking to Lauren from Happy Haunts Library, and she brought to attention to me novelizations for like My Bloody Valentines and Silent Night, Deadly Night, and like I had never even heard of these novelizations. So I was really happy to find out they existed. Not so happy to figure out that, like the Severin Books ones, no ebooks available, only limited print runs, and pretty expensive. And it seems like it's more of a full collector's item now, and there's always limited supplies of it. The one company that does still exist that does novelizations, reprints and prints new ones, is Encyclopocalypse. Now, Encyclopocalypse, the owner is kind of a dink, but that aside, they do hire some cool writers, and they do republish harder to find novelizations. Again, these will mostly be horror, but like they reprinted the Wishmaster novelization, but they also will go to newer writers who are kind of in the sphere and have them write the novelizations. Because, for example, this is Scared to Death. This is a novel written by Matt Serafini. Matt Serafini is a modern horror writer, and he popped in there. I know Attack of the Killer Tomatoes is coming out, and that is written by Jeff Strand. What is nice about Encyclopocalypse is that they have ebooks available, so it's a lot easier to get them no matter what your price range is. I like to buy them physically, although I hate this bind up. I don't like this size of books. I really don't like the way these look. Especially when it's a reprint and like, you know, that this was kind of like designed to fit. The covers were designed to fit on a mass market size, but that's neither here nor there. So novelizations are everywhere from a certain era and nowhere in the modern day. They exist, but they are super limited. I believe more video games get novelized than movies anymore. It's just a matter of the genre. They have kind of gone the way of the dodo, but you can still find them. There are still people keeping the good fight alive. So yeah, that's just a little bit of a history and some knowledge and, you know, just some talking about novelizations. Hope you read some this month and you have a good time. Thank you and goodbye.